Everything in my career seemed to go smoothly until the spring of 1939, at which point this otherwise untroubled, cheerful 28-year-old country boy was suddenly confronted by new and seemingly insurmountable obstacles. I was, however, happily able to draw strength in the knowledge that there was a good woman at my side who supported me in both heart and soul. In one area, von Hanstein and I differed, for while he kept photos of his family on his work desk, I refused to do so, reasoning that being so close to the enemy and expecting at any moment an enemy artillery shell to hit the house, or to have to fight off the Russians in hand-to-hand combat, such peaceful images of domestic everyday life amid death and destruction might only increase my sense of vulnerability. Perhaps it was the experience of having to repeatedly move into new quarters, which at first were clean, tidy, and reminiscent of home, only to find them soon shattered and soiled in battle. Perhaps it was also the bitter knowledge that even when the best men are killed, their memory is soon confined to distant and infrequent thought or forgotten altogether. Captain von Hanstein originally came from an armoured formation where he had been ordnance officer with the 1st Panzer Army, but now, for the first time, he had the opportunity to ride and show off his love of horses. Even if Artillery Regiment 162 had better animals at its disposal, and in Captain Franco enjoyed a first-rate instructor, I believe von Hanstein greatly relished the freedom he had with us, where he was free to explore many riding trails away from the eye of the enemy, and beyond the range of his guns. Although the horses had to skirt around the skeletons of wrecked sleds, equipment, and other detritus of war, we were nevertheless surrounded by a beautiful and peaceful landscape. Von Hanstein charmed us all with his youthful sense of adventure, his refreshing intellect, and his open-mindedness. He was in all senses a good friend, projecting himself neither as a subordinate nor a superior, was a good listener, and was able to introduce much that was new in the world of infantry tactics. Later on, he was given command of a gun battery under Captain Franco, and the two would sometimes drop in for a cup of coffee, which gave me the opportunity to get to know the latter, who was widely known as a cheery sort of gunnery officer, who had already earned the German Cross in Gold, one of the first to do so. I soon came to admire him for being an upstanding, down-to-earth commander of the old school. Some weeks later, when we were already occupying a new defence sector, Captain Franco, having just returned from leave from his estate in Silesia, came over to visit and, in an amusing fashion, described how reactionary and stubborn he had found the local population to be. He concluded his comments by laughingly declaring that were he and the 62nd Division ever to return to Germany, he might just as willingly turn his guns on his own people, a sentiment not entirely unfamiliar to me from my experiences in Pomerania. On one sweltering hot afternoon, a small car pulled up in front of our hill, and the hitherto unfamiliar lanky figure of our divisional commander climbed out. I stepped up and saluted, and then briefed him at the map table. After that, we drove together through the dusk to Belaja Gora, so that I could offer him an overview of our defence positions in the river valley. Along the way, we stopped at the small whitewashed house, occupied by Captain Ukro, who appeared in his shirt sleeves to salute and make his report, while standing in the middle of the dusty road. I noticed a cloud of disapproval come over the divisional commander's dark, leathery face, which, once inside and listening to Ukro's concise and detailed briefing, quickly evaporated. Ukro and I often spoke fondly of that evening and of the visit of our sharp-faced commander, whose unruffled demeanour radiated calmness, confidence, and intelligence. He was Colonel Eberding, who had recently taken command of the division, having originally hailed from the 14th Motorised Division, which, in August of 1941, had stood on our flank, and later in July of 1942, had relieved the 6th Division when we were just east of Rushu. Towards the end of May, construction of our front line was almost complete. The main trench system was finished, and up to a distance of 8 kilometres additional support trenches and in-depth strong points stood ready. The civilian labourers had performed well and had proven themselves agreeable and willing even during the uncomfortable nights when the enemy attempted to disrupt the work with artillery and machine gun fire. As a result, they too had suffered a few lightly and 1 or 2 more severely wounded, yet they acknowledged how we did our utmost to protect them, and only when a group walked into an unmarked minefield was their trust in us greatly diminished. Each weekend, the workers would return to their villages, and, despite our sector being an especially dangerous one, They never failed to report for work on Monday morning. About this time, however, something terrible took place in the area of Kaganovice, which in one single stroke threatened to undo all our valuable work in gaining the trust of the local population. A detachment in the vicinity of an old minefield from 1941-42 had marched a group of women and girls arm in arm across a minefield, resulting in a bloodbath with many dead and others severely injured. Following 2 successive winter retreats, were we now going to experience a summer retreat as well? That was a question I kept asking myself. Having carefully reflected on all aspects of our situation and setting aside wishful thinking, I knew somehow that our army could not remain here on the Donets indefinitely. All orders suggested otherwise, but nothing that was said gave me much confidence. There was nothing visible even to I of the lowest ranker that suggested anything positive or gave any reason for optimism. Our sector was huge in length, the demands on the relatively few troops were enormous, and as for material support, what arrived from the rear was ridiculously little in the way of mines, barbed wire, hand grenades, and even flares. We had 9 flare pistols for a stretch of front covering 8 kilometers, so that it was child's play for the Russians to penetrate our trenches at night, kill a few individuals or lay a few mines. We often had the impression that entire groups of enemy agents had passed through in the darkness on their way to our rear. Every soldier had to be fully familiar with the handling our machine guns, of which there were 3 types. We had 8 MG-42, for which we had only the highest praise, then MG-34, but the greatest number consisted of the technically complicated MG-26. Each company possessed a meagre 9 to 12 machine guns, so that it was no longer possible to hold even 1 gun in reserve. The number beside the model denoted the year it first came into service. Up until June, anti-tank weapons were absent altogether, and only then did they begin to dribble in. On our side, saving ammunition was written large. However, the enemy appeared to have no shortage of anything, and from dawn till dusk his machine guns and artillery rounds echoed up and down the river in an overwhelming ammunition expenditure, which at night brightly lit up our corner of the riverbank. Night-time trench inspections were often a joke. Our double guards lay about 150 to 200 metres apart, and progressing the length of the largely unmanned trench rounding corner upon corner, I reckoned I was just as likely to bump into a stray Russian soldier as into one of my own men or a group of 20 to 30 men and women quietly digging under the watchful eye of a solitary soldier. Who was to know if any one of these people had secretly crossed the river to join the work detail with the intention of returning in a week or 2 to report our exact disposition and strength? With the gradual reduction in number and quality of troops, I was painfully aware that any Russian assault was likely only to be brought to a halt by a mobile defence in depth. The only practical solution, therefore, was to deport all able-bodied men and women from the area, unless needed for our own uses, put the torch to any and all agricultural and industrial enterprises, tear up all road and rail facilities, and finally ruthlessly convert each and every village into a free-standing fortification. Furthermore, during the course of the year, all cultivated crops should be harvested, and instead of storing the product locally where they might fall into the hands of the enemy, ship them back as quickly as possible. Once the army had adopted this essential policy, it nonetheless caused me great distress to see how much of our energy was being spent on wholesale destruction, and while on my way to the hospital, I could clearly see the desolation caused by this scorched earth policy. An example of why it was deemed necessary to pursue such a terrible policy of destruction occurred in Gorskoye, where the regimental commander, wanting to impress the locals with typical German cleanliness and order, took a childish delight in installing neat and tidy gardens with proper drainage, sowing grass and brightening each house with a fresh coat of whitewash. When on a moonlit night enemy bombers arrived overhead, all their crews had to do was aim their bombs at the newly painted walls below to score a hit. After that experience, what wasn't demolished was hastily painted a dull grey. Another distressing example was a solidly constructed narrow-gauge railway, which had taken us more than 3 months to finish only to have the entire line to fall into Russian hands a mere 3 days later. Further back, there were more examples of costly and elaborate work that may have been fine examples of German thoroughness and attention to detail, but added nothing to the strength of our defences or to slowing the enemy advance. The arrival of Colonel Eberding as commander of our division was happily accompanied by an inflow of all manner of construction and defence material, leading to our position becoming steadily more formidable. While this desperate work was being carried out, the commander of I Battalion of Grenadier Regiment 684 dropped dead, which meant a replacement was required. At the same time, an order arrived instructing my regiment to take over our neighbour's sector to the north, where, starting at the beginning of April, there had already been bitter fighting with the Russians trying to expand their bridgehead around the village of Priwolodje. According to reports, the enemy had successfully attacked a Turkmenistan battalion and had only been brought to a standstill after costly fighting, and although the battle continued to rage back and forth, we were unable to dislodge the Russians from the village. Enemy tactics had included the use of mobile artillery and tanks. Their mobile artillery vehicles, being only lightly armoured, were easily dealt with by our anti-tank guns, but the battle continued to rage up and down the entire river bend. Of note was the absence of conventional Russian artillery, which was usually the cause of most casualties, but instead we found ourselves heavily engaged in hand-to-hand fighting with enemy infantry, who had dug their trenches within mere metres from our own, and even on so-called quiet days, the bloody tally on our side still amounted to between 60 and 80 casualties. While this northern sector was taken over by the 354 Grenadier Regiment, our old positions were occupied by elements of the army to our south, commanded by General Hollitt. Once the relief was complete, the regiment set off in the small hours of the night via Mirnaya Dolina, marching in a large semicircle behind Hill 180 and the Sochos communal farm until we were finally out of sight of the enemy. From the heights of Hill 180, we had an unforgettable view to the southeast, where it was already growing light and the distant woods and sand hills resembling huge clouds. Banks took on the colour of roses and lilac. The villages in the valley and on the hillside showed no sign of life, even as the grey of night was beginning to give way to a pale yellow dawn. Having spent so much time on the wild, undulating steppe, we now found ourselves entering an industrial area consisting at first of 4 or 5 multi-storied breeze-block apartment buildings that seemed to rise straight up out of a cornfield. A short while later, we came upon a cobblestone road, leading us to a large, modern, garishly coloured glass factory, which reminded me of the region around the city of Pilsen. To our left and right stood older, single-storey worker houses, built along tree-lined streets, all running at right angles from the main road. It was a place to which many people had been evacuated from the battle zone. A typical morning market was in progress, surrounded by a gathering of evil-smelling, unwashed people in greasy rags, all spitting their usual sunflower seeds and wren. Daring the notion of me buying something becoming an almost nauseating thought. This was the town of Werchneje, where the railway passed over a high embankment, where roads were crudely paved, and houses stood wall to wall, and where our predecessors had established an extensive defence position in a wide arc following the railway line. An earlier Russian attack had penetrated the line and had almost reached the regimental command post, but was beaten back by exemplary cooperation between artillery and infantry. Defence positions in this sector to the east of town were a concern to me, because they had been dug in a location from where our sentries were unable to see the river. As a result, that same night, my men were ordered to dig into the stone hard ground, simply to take up positions from where they were able to see what was happening on the far bank. In my mind, it was sheer luck that nothing happened in that sector, because I knew our movement had not gone unnoticed. Our presence, furthermore, was made apparent to the enemy by fresh white chalk thrown up from our digging, and he attempted nearly every night to cross over the river with reconnaissance and raiding parties. Under the cover of heavy artillery and a mortar barrage, he tried to reach our side by raft and boat, and on 2 occasions succeeded in reaching our guard posts, but failed to take any prisoners. With an all-out effort, out-strong points were reinforced with barbed wire and mines, something that inexplicably had not been done by our predecessors. The aim was to make it almost impossible for the Russians to attack without suffering heavy casualties, and encourage them to turn their attention to a less heavily fortified section of the front. This they found further north, but of that later. Enemy pressure and his overall behaviour was much as we had experience further south, whereas during daylight hours the artillery and mortars remained quiet and the far shore showed little sign of life. Come nightfall, the fireworks began anew. There were no visible signs of an immediate enemy attack, and prisoners brought in by our patrols declared how their officers were convinced there would be no Russian push that summer. Whether a matter of routine, or just in our Donetsk sector, we learned that the enemy officers facing us, who were mostly from Moscow, were especially hard on their men. An example given was the case of a lieutenant who, while inspecting his sentries, immediately shot a man found looking towards the rear. We also knew about the composition of enemy regiments and punishment battalions, and knew that little had changed since the 1st of March, other than the issue of crisp new summer uniforms. Of course, we dared not rely exclusively on the word of prisoners, because it was a known Russian tactic to conceal their intentions by giving the impression that units facing us were worn out and run down. This wariness was later shown to be justified when a prisoner interview revealed that a general had paid a visit to enemy units in the woods, immediately opposite Regiment 135. Apparently, a soldier had stepped forward and asked to be excused, because he was short-sighted, to which the general had replied that every man must first do his duty and chase the Germans away from the Donets, and when the country was finally free of the enemy, then he could go home. In any event, nothing much happened on our front at first. Then there followed an attack designed to throw us off balance. On the 17th of July, the enemy succeeded in breaking though further south and dislodging our last remaining units from the far shore. By this time, my battalion was structured as follows. On the left of our sector stood 2nd Company under the command of 1st Lieutenant Kratzer, in the centre 3rd Company under 1st Lieutenant Brain, and on the right 1st Company under the command of Lieutenant Pommer. 4th Company, which had only just been formed on April 1st, was temporarily under the command of Lieutenant Scholz, followed by Lieutenant Bremke, while its regular commander, 1st Lieutenant Lemke, was away in Germany on a course. My battalion command headquarters were first set up in the house used by my predecessor, which lay beside a large cemetery and 200 metres from the church. It stood in the centre of town and lacked any sort of overview, so on the 10th of June I moved to a new location at the southern edge of town, into the centre of our battalion front from where I had a better picture of what was happening. Most of the houses in Werchnoi were built of brick and plaster with a full-length veranda overlooking an abundant fruit and vegetable garden. Inside these square cube-like houses rooms were bright and clean with simple ceiling designs, tall, narrow double doors with the customary glass grips instead of metal handles. The furniture, which often including a piano, would not have looked out of place in Germany and consisted of vases, pictures, a chiming wall clock, coffee tables, and much more. It was all in the style of old Russia, yet was clean and cared for. During my 10-day residency, I found myself being drawn to the cultured and peaceful atmosphere of those rooms, a sense that quickly evaporated when stepping outside onto the veranda and hearing the deafening thunder of Russian shells and the sizzling buzz of the flickering flares. Sometime later, perhaps at the end of June or early July, at a time when the battalion was being relieved for a 10-day period by the Sector Battalion of Panzer Grenadier Regiment 63, I ventured out on a scorching hot morning and found Lieutenant Moll at the piano in shorts and shirt-sleeves deeply immersed in playing a classical piece. All matters pertaining to the civilian population had to be dealt with at regimental level, and for that purpose an officer was assigned the task who, even with the assistance of trusted locals, found himself fully occupied. His main duties consisted of arranging for food supplies, putting all able-bodied men and women to work, policing the communities and evacuating civilians from the battle zone. Food was issued in accordance with completed work norms of various labour gangs, from which supply, however, children, the sick and elderly, and all others incapable of work had to be fed. Because food was never in sufficient quantity, many women dodged the work columns and lived on hidden food resources or worked the vegetable gardens, while others had to labour through 2 shifts to get enough to feed young and old. Their main source of food came from digging for the battalion, as well as looking after the domestic requirements of the artillery and the engineers. A number were employed in the kitchens, the stables, and in the troop accommodations, although a specific order had been issued by division forbidding the employment of local girls and women in the cleaning and maintenance of battalion officer accommodation. They were to be restricted to the kitchens and to company-level battle posts. However, not unexpectedly this order was met with considerable resistance, and it was only after further instruction and regular inspections that the command was finally obeyed. The charm and grace of the local women was frequently in evidence, and one can imagine my astonishment when one day I arrived to discover that a group of young women had decorated my HQ with flowers. No doubt such peaceful coexistence had its propaganda value, but unless tempered, the dangers, especially at the front, came from the threat of espionage, a breakdown in discipline, and a cessation of mutual cooperation, just to name a few. To assist in his policing duties, the commander had the Ukrainian auxiliary police in their distinctive all-black uniforms and grey collars, who proved to be very useful in evacuating the battle zone and preventing others from trying to reoccupy houses already emptied. It would have, however, been foolhardy to trust these men any more than the civilians. Counter-spy measures were carried out by members of the battalion in conjunction with our military police, but there were many fine Ukrainians who worked for us untiringly, and for whom we had the highest praise. During one of my first days in the town of Verchneya, I took the opportunity to poke my head into one of the apartment blocks in the town's westernmost corner. The experience was not a pleasant one, for there was hardly a room where old men and women were not found lying in the most wretched conditions, either on filthy rags, simple wooden boards, or even on stone-cold floors. More than a few were only days from death. These last were of a pre-Bolshevik generation who were slowly dying away in this present-day savage, merciless world. The difficulty lay in that, while able-bodied citizens were required to stay and work, others had to be evacuated from the battle zone, which often led to families being torn apart, and to achieve that end, sometimes force had to be used. In June, we were finally able to turn this unpleasant task over to an officer assigned by division, following which we could once again turn all our attention to the work of strengthening the front line. By this time, my battalion employed upwards of 600 people, and when shielded from enemy view, the shifts were able to work both day and night on our defences. Around the church and further south, new strong points were needed, and it was heartening to see the gaily chattering columns of female labourers in their headscarves and white skirts passing by on their way to dig in places, sometimes no more than 100 metres from the enemy. A column of the night shift passed by each evening with shovels and spades over shoulders, and they never failed to give me a friendly greeting. At daybreak, the same column would stamp its way back from the front line for their day of rest. In an attempt to disrupt the work, the Russians often dropped mortar shells onto the labour columns, causing an ever-growing number of injuries. Having had one of their reconnaissance patrols chased off from the northern part of our line, the Russians resorted to further nighttime assaults in the Esiktayan held by 2nd Company, where cherry trees and shrubbery gave them good cover. On a moonless night, an enemy patrol actually succeeded in pushing through between 2 sentry posts and attacking 2 of our men and about 20 women who were busy digging. On that occasion, the Russians had appeared from the rear and had called out in German, which fooled the guards, and gave the enemy time to shoot and throw hand grenades. While the women had quickly scattered, one of the 2 sentries was killed, and by the time the company commander, Lieutenant Eichler, who had been a mere 50 metres distant, came to the rescue, the enemy was gone, taking with them 1 old woman and a machine gun. Sitting on the edge of the trench next to the dead was a young girl who could be heard repeating, "I have no leg, I have no leg," and indeed the poor creature had one of her legs ripped away just below the knee by a grenade blast. The old women who had been taken away apparently drowned while crossing the river to the Russian side. Before we finished clearing our field of fire, something our predecessors had failed to do, another attack occurred. 2 enemy soldiers had swum across the river and hidden in the thick undergrowth before attacking our sentries in broad daylight and killing 2 with single pistol shots to the head. Both Russians then made good their escape. Once we finally cleared away the undergrowth and had laid a network of mines, enemy activity in our sector died down. We finally had sufficient construction material and defence equipment on hand to permit us to put 2 engineer platoons to work, and seeing more rapid progress was deeply satisfying. The 2 unexpected attacks outlined above in 3rd Company sector told me that the men there had not received the same level of training in combating ambushes by stealth as those in the other companies. In the middle of June 1st, Lieutenant Bryan was wounded and shipped out, leaving Lieutenant Eichner to take over the company and begin the necessary instructions. There are few places where the personality and character of a commander does not reflect on the effectiveness of his company. If he is irresolute, unsure and hesitant, then even the best company of men will soon mirror its leader. If on the other hand the commander is decisive, both mentally and physically tough and resolute, then his company will soon become equally robust. It was also my experience that a commander's occupation in civilian life had little influence over his performance in the field. Brine, who had generally been a disappointment, had been an attorney before the war. A good platoon and company commander needed in reality little more than a good understanding of his men, excellent health and above all an unwavering determination. In my opinion, it was high time to discard the outdated prerequisite of the baccalaureate as the first condition to an officer career. I held the view that firstly academic levels in the Reich had fallen so much as to make such exams almost worthless, and secondly, the caliber of today's teachers was far below what it used to be. Even in my time in 1931, I remember there being a number of shiftless, uninspired baccalaureate graduates, alongside boys who, while perhaps less academically inclined, were made of excellent junior officer material. On the 17th of June, the summer heat seemed to have reached its zenith. The phone rang and my HQ Lieutenant Colonel Peltret, my regimental commander, was at the other end and was calling to say goodbye. He was being relieved of his command because he had been found ignorant of the number of mines laid in the regimental sector and the number of machine guns in his unit. He was being transferred to France and wished me all the best. He made reference to my matter, and when asked to explain, merely replied that my file had finally arrived. I almost laughed. Whole countries had been invaded, their people conquered and occupied before the army bureaucracy decides to deliver my personnel file to my senior officer. My matter, which oddly continued to dog me, was my stub-born determination to marry Patricia, a citizen of a country we were at war with, and for having the temerity of pursuing my demand over the heads of senior officers all the way to the very top. There was no regret among the officers at the change of commander. In a military sense, Peltret had been vague, lacked any understanding of the larger picture, and was also the type of man who would smilingly stab one in the back just to make himself look good. Thanks to a tip from Captain von Hanstein, I had learned that the regimental commander once described me as naive and insubordinate, from which I guessed that my forthcoming performance assessment would be a big 0. My fellow officers and I laughed heartily at this nonsense, and having long since shed myself of all military ambition, I was able to simply shrug off the criticism. In the scorching heat of that same morning, I got word that an unfamiliar colonel was poking around the battle line. It was Colonel Schmidt, a regimental commander in the 15th Division stationed around Izjum, and who was to assume temporary command of our regiment. He fired a few questions at me in quick succession. How long in the regiment? Since January. How long in the army? Since 1931. He shot a quick glance at my rank insignia. Did you came through the NCO ranks? No, I was an officer cadet in 1931 with Infantry Regiment 3. Really? So why haven't you risen faster? I really can't say, Colonel. It's a mystery to me too. There followed a short conference around my command post table, upon which my Batman had carefully laid out our maps under a sheet of glass. That was followed by the Colonel's first orders, and within 48 hours the entire regiment noticed that they had a very different man in command. The thick-headed Peltret was gone, and in his place was a man who clearly made close cooperation between all units an uppermost priority. Orders issued were now clear and concise, and even contradicted some of those issued by his predecessor. The new colonel quickly revealed that he was a forceful man with firm ideas, leaving no one in any doubt where he stood. Morale in the regiment improved immensely, and although what was now being asked was more than before, everyone was glad to pull their weight, knowing that in the long run they were making their own lives easier. The new man also made a nuisance of himself at division, and demanded and received an added supply of defence material and equipment, along with a fresh batch of replacement troops. A reserve company had originally been approved for our sector, although we never had enough men to fill it, but now I was finally able to form an engineer platoon, consisting of 2 squads headed up by the seasoned Sergeant Froelich. My battalion now had a reserve unit to call upon in emergencies. During the new commander's first conference, it was quite unexpectedly announced that we were going to be replaced by 2/Panzer Grenadier Regiment 63 on the 23rd of June, and we were to hold ourselves in readiness to move back into our old sector. This shift took place just as ordered, and with my battalion now under the command of Captain Lindenberg, a holder of the Knight's Cross, it moved into the village of Volcheya Roka, approximately 8 kilometers behind the front line. The first job upon arrival in the grey, dust-covered village was to board trucks belonging to the Panzer Grenadier Battalion, because our troops had to be ready during the course of the relief in case the enemy decided to intervene. Once in reserve, all energies were directed at a company-by-company drill on the handling of light machine guns, heavy infantry weapons such as anti-tank guns and improving marksmanship, as well as NCO training for suitable candidates. Possessing a counter-attack reserve and anticipating its future use, I acquainted myself with the terrain and conditions facing us. Under a brilliant summer sky, a conference was held to discuss the best use of our terrain and to also draw up counter-attack tactics in the area of the 3 towns. In attendance were officers from both Army Corps and Divisions 62 and 38, who were our closest neighbours to the north, and what was discussed were the basic requirements to ensure close cooperation with tanks and mobile artillery in the event of night combat in the built-up area. Aside from our many daily duties, there was finally an opportunity to enjoy some rest and relaxation. The regimental band often struck up in the village and was quickly surrounded by dust-covered soldiers, many of whom had to become reaccustomed to moving about freely away from foxholes and trenches. A Ukrainian variety troupe also erected a stage at the edge of the village and was the cause of much enthusiastic clapping and hilarious laughter. One evening, all battalion officers got together for an evening of beer and champagne, and while setting aside all military formalities, exchanged funny stories and experiences. In the small hours, waves of laughter could be heard coming from the command post where the assistant surgeon, Dr. Behrend, took us through a typical bureaucratic operations report in his delightfully amusing East Prussian dialect. On a wind-still evening, when the air was filled with the sweet scent of hot grass, I was invited to dine with the divisional commander. A table had been erected under tall cherry trees, and we ate, drank and talked until 11 p.m. Seated on one side of Colonel Aberding was Colonel Klotz, the deputy, and on his other side Major Janda, and facing them among others, as I recall, sat Major von Uchtritz, the divisional adjutant and Captain Rand of Regiment 354. During this period in reserve, a new regimental commander made his appearance. He was Colonel Summerlad. The battalion was drawn up in an open square in the village, and no sooner had Colonel Summerlad introduced himself than Colonel Schmidt bade us farewell in a few short, well-chosen words. His brevity, so untypical of many, was mirrored by Colonel Summerlad, who immediately sought to test the level of cooperation with our neighbouring regiment and discuss the eventuality of an enemy attack directed at the unit boundary. Because I knew the area, I was ordered to accompany him, and upon descending into the valley, could easily identify the familiar chalk outcrop and the small subterranean accommodation. Nothing had changed. The commander's HQ, with its large white-washed room and big glass window pointing to the rear, was just as Tager and I had left it only a few months earlier. It now became the scene of a boozy gathering of officers. Colonel Summerlad and the commander of the flanking regiment appeared to know each other and sank into a lengthy conversation until Colonel Schmidt, who was pressed for time, interrupted and insisted that we complete the purpose of our visit. In a crisp, clear voice, he enumerated all the salient points that needed to be discussed. His opposite number, whose name I have forgotten, was of a very different ilk, and ran off at the mouth with flowery, smug, self-congratulatory remarks. I followed the conversation with intense interest because I knew from Lieutenant Pommer, commander of 1st Company, just how much difficulty he had had in the past in securing cooperation from the neighbouring regiment. Its commander, as far as I recall, had been a senior adjutant somewhere, and now loudly exclaimed how this or that mishap could never happen in his sector, or that such an oversight could never happen in his unit. He then turned the discussion to running down Peltrit, and how he had never before come across such a wretched regimental command post. We finally took our leave of this empty boasting, hot air and flagrant dishonesty. All this from a man filled with reckless military ambition, and who, like so many others officers of his kind, appeared to have been chiselled from stone, and were only too willing to cover up any enemy successes lest it be seen as a personal failure and reflect badly on his craving for medals and promotion. On our return journey, I cast an appreciative glance over at Colonel Schmidt. Although he was leaving, he was not in the least bit fooled by the bombastic utterances of the other commander, whose false bonhomie had made him seem even more of a fraud. 2 weeks later, on the 17th of July, the Russians commenced their attack on the heels of a 2-hour artillery bombardment. The width of their advance stretched from the Caesar ravine via Belaja Gora to the southernmost edge of the town of Wurchneja, and while the enemy failed to get a foothold on our bank, he managed to penetrate our neighbour's sector and seize Hill 126 and our old command post. From the hill, the Russians entered the defences of Belaja Gora, which the valiant First Lieutenant Pommer and his men were defending until he was killed. Sadly, at the time of his death, he was not to know that he had been awarded the Knight's Cross. By evening, the line defended by Battalion 179 was back in our hands, and the last remaining enemy units were eliminated in the Dora ravine by reconnaissance elements belonging to our neighbouring division to the south. My Batman Targa gave me all these details in a letter while I was awaiting a doctor's appointment on the 2nd or 3rd of July, for on the final day in Volchaya Roka, I experienced yet again a nauseating dizziness that had occurred previously from time to time, and which made it impossible for me to concentrate. That same evening, Corporal Mack brought me in his vehicle to Vershneya. Members of the 1st Battalion of Regiment 179 had successfully rescued an elegant 4-passenger car from the ruins of Stalingrad. The car was now chauffeured and lovingly cared for by Mack, a man from Cologne, who had thus far successfully dodged all appropriation attempts by a jealous neighbouring battalion transport officer. On a previous drive, I recall Mack describing with stoic courage how he had lost everything during a recent air raid on Cologne. The night was calm, and next morning my replacement took over the battalion without incident. Making my way to 3rd Company along the all-too-familiar path, I was once again overcome by crippling spells of dizziness and bodily listlessness, physical conditions I had suffered from off and on from as early as April, and which now made life almost unbearable. The doctor came, and it was then I first heard the word Meniere. The rest of the day was spent at my desk, but early next morning. A day that promised warmth and sunshine. The whole debilitating business struck again, making even the slightest attempt to stand almost impossible. Lying there with eyes closed, I heard the approaching aircraft. Immediately above me, a Russian fighter broke away from his flight and landed about 300 meters away in the long, wet grass. I was unable to get to my feet, but had an uneasy feeling. A couple of thick-headed gunners from a nearby battery raced towards the downed aircraft, from which the pilot had calmly climbed out and promptly gunned him down. By the time First Lieutenant Pommer arrived with his usual alacrity, it was all over. The brand-new Russian aircraft was found to have run out of fuel. On the young pilot's lifeless body, which lacked all customary flying gear and was dressed only in boots, summer shirt and track pants, our men found a roughly drawn map and a notebook. This was shipped to the rear for further examination. The enemy pilot with his simple flying kit was another example of how the Russians were able to make do with the very minimum. This aspect is further evidenced by tank drivers who sat on wooden boxes as they drove their tanks straight from the factory floor to the front. I was reminded of another, perhaps more experienced Russian flyer who described the astonishingly simplicity of his machine. Everything was adjustable at the turn of a hand without electrical assistance, and whereas our pilots could adjust their seats up and down with the press of a button, the Russian pilot did it by hand. In their aeroplanes, tanks, and heavy trucks, just to name a few, we quickly came to understand how each had been reduced to the lowest yet highly effective technical common denominator. Their mass-produced vehicles, which we encountered right from the beginning, were consciously designed without the refinements so typically expected by Western armies. Yet the results were astonishingly simple, highly effective and immensely durable, even under the roughest of conditions. Another characteristic to be found in this generation of Russians was an extraordinary talent for organizing people both in the military as well as in industry. Those who had likely experienced the great failures of the Great War would certainly notice this remarkable top-down transformation. I made a feeble attempt to contradict the doctor's prognosis, but in the end, he declared me unfit for duty. He was right, of course, because I felt so wretchedly ill that I questioned whether I would be capable of making any decisions in a moment of crisis. On the evening of July 5th, Captain Contney arrived to take over the battalion, and as I departed, the last I saw was a freshly dug grave in the back garden where the pilot had been buried. Had his gas tank really been empty? Could he not have glided back over the river, or had it been his intention all along to come over to us just as thousands of others had before him? On that brilliant sunny day, Mac drove me to the hospital in Kaganovice. Looking back from the high ground, I had one last look of farewell to the so familiar landscape and skyline of Verneia and Proletarsk. We had arrived only a few months earlier when survival was day to day, while now enjoying the dubious luxury of living from month to month. It felt as if we had been there for years. A 1-hour drive through a shimmering green steppe passing through the 1941-40 seconds battle zone, I arrived at the ugly square, grey apartment blocks of Kaganovice, and at the hospital where I was brusquely told to come back tomorrow. I said goodbye to Mac, my driver, after which Batka, my Batman, and I sought accommodation for the night. The heat had already reached its peak in the early afternoon, at which time the streets were nearly empty, and windows either shuttered or covered to keep out the scorching sunshine. The whitewashed little house to which I had been assigned was not outwardly welcoming with its bolted shutters and dried-up cherry trees. However, inside it was both cool and clean. My landlady was an undernourished young woman who lived there with her children and a 17-year-old sister. Her husband had been a Russian army engineer and was listed as missing. While I was given space in the living room for the night, Batka was directed to the house next door, where the door was promptly slammed in his face by an old woman who declared angrily that her house was for officers only. At that point, I took her to one side and gently explained how Batka had come with me, and that he was a true gentleman. In response to my plea, her face suddenly lit up, and with unexpected tenderness she studied Batka through big blue eyes before stroking his bright red cheeks and declaring that everything was just fine. I was always taken aback by how these folk were capable of creating such sudden and vigorous facial expressions, especially when, sometimes for months on end, all we saw were blank looks. My landlady later told me that the old woman next door had once been a beauty and a well-known actress. The following day, I underwent a medical examination which resulted in nothing except a transfer to the army hospital in Gorlauka, where I had another wait of a couple of days. With Batka's generous accumulation of bread rations, we succeeded in gaining the trust of our hostess and her 17-year-old daughter, whose plaits reached down to her waist. In the evening, the three of us sat around the kitchen table. Batka was off on some errand, and the two spoke of their life and how they saw the world around them. There were interesting observations from before the war, but what fascinated me most was their opinion of the Germans and the occupation, and following so many tumultuous winter months at the front, I was hearing something about life behind the front. The girl, who like so many other women, worked from early morning until late afternoon digging anti-tank ditches, was no doubt one of many who turned their heads away in haughty disdain when confronted by the grey mass of German soldiers. I was pleased to have gained their confidence to such a degree that they felt free to voice the opinion that Germany, surrounded on all sides by strong military powers, was sure to be defeated, and the Russians would soon be in Kaganovice once again. The conversation concluded with the question whether there was any use in our carrying on with the war. I wanted to respond to her honesty with equal honesty, but I dared not, so all I could do was say that Hitler had made the average German believe he or she was capable of superhuman effort. The women seemed impressed by the social improvements introduced by Hitler after 1933, but then asked why, when with so much good work, why certain German agricultural leaders allowed to squirrel away so much for their own personal consumption and live like kings when folk all around were starving. The two continued to rattle off examples of bribery and corruption, beginning with the police, who used their position to enrich themselves and their friends by falsifying egg and ham quotas. Then the local village or town commandant allowed himself to be bribed, and even the lowly private overseeing girls and women digging ditches was known to withhold wages unless one or the other agreed to sleep with him. My feeble explanation was that while all the best men were away at the front, in Russia, France, Italy and Scandinavia, regrettably even the unscrupulous had to be employed. It was already midnight when we rose from the table. Time seemed to have flown by in such a deeply rewarding conversation with two fine women who possessed a remarkably clear and wise view of their world. I even had a brief exchange with the old women next door, who unhesitatingly declared that Hitler was doomed, to which I replied somewhat lamely that if that were the case, he would end up dying in the ruins of Berlin. Despite the enforcement of rigorous discipline since 1933 and into the war years, there still appeared to be a general inclination for personal enrichment and corruption at all levels of authority. The post-World War I years of hunger and economic misery had certainly undermined general standards of decency, and the 6 years leading to the outbreak of this war had not been enough time to wipe out these corrupting influences. I recall a visit by General von Witzleben in early 1935, during which he called department officers together, and in unmistakable words warned us about the sins of crass materialism and grasping self-enrichment. He said this malaise cuts through all levels of society, including the army. I was of course by then aware how this twisted culture had been alive and well amongst the ranks of France's occupying forces. Here in the East, it turned my stomach just thinking about it, yet, as I was soon to discover, corruption in our back areas was only slightly more entrenched than in the homeland, and that perhaps lay in the fact that opportunities in the Reich for self-enrichment were by now much less abundant. Who, I asked myself, is going to put a value to the spilled blood of good men fighting at the front and measure it to the corrupt black market in eggs, ham and honey? These unsettling thoughts first occurred in Kaganovice and followed me all the way to Gorlovka and Dnepropetrovsk. Whereas we Germans might be more likely to understand how this sort of behind-the-front corruption came to be, those Russians living with us were understandably unable to reconcile our actions on the ground with our lofty, highly touted administration policies. In the end, they likely just resigned themselves to being cheated and robbed, although, in the end, preferred it at least to be by someone who spoke their own language. The views voiced in that little White House by the mother and her daughter proved to me how closely the local population had entirely seen us Germans, not so much as enemies, but as a force capable of reintroducing levels of justice and fairness long since abandoned by the Soviets. A similar encounter took place in June near Belaja Gora, where we were in the process of expanding a defence strongpoint. There I met a young man of about 20 who had been watching me with great curiosity as I studied the terrain through binoculars. With the delight of an inquisitive child, he accepted my offer to take a look. He was a tall, slender boy with an intelligent face, and had he not been dressed in rags, his behaviour and manners might have been those of an Oxford University student. The way he studied and explored the use of the binoculars betrayed a keen thirst for knowledge and a surprising understanding of human behaviour. Such encounters with members of the local population will always remain memorable experiences amid the endless drudgery of digging defence positions. Next morning it was on by rail to Nikitauka, so I bade goodbye to Batka for the last time and watched him turn his back and stride briskly out of the station. From Nikitauka I obtained further transportation by hitchhiking the 8-kilometre stretch leading to Gorlauka, an ugly industrial town boasting a former Russian infirmary at the edge of town. Its yellow and grey buildings were now home to a German army hospital. I spent the next 10 days in Gorlovka taking small walks and exploring a little of the town and its surroundings. On the morning of the 17th of July, I was finally shipped to an auxiliary hospital at Dnepropetrovsk, where once again I didn't know which end was up and was unable to get up from my bed. I must have been asleep when we crossed the Dnepr River, but remember being delivered into a small hospital standing immediately opposite a building that had once housed the NKVD, precursor to the KGB, but now was either home to the regional commissar or a local economic administration. I can't exactly remember which. Nonetheless, from my window I was able to observe a steady coming and going of brown uniformed personnel, each with wide belts over sagging bellies, broad breeches and high-peaked gold-trimmed caps perched above dull, uninteresting faces. They all resembled former coachmen. A captain, with whom I was sharing the room, had likewise been studying the scene across the way, murmured, "May God help us." There was only one individual entering and leaving the building opposite who didn't look like a tram conductor, and he was an older man in civilian clothes sporting a party badge who was met each evening by a woman we took to be his wife. Our corner window also gave us a unique opportunity to study the traffic below. Battered trams trundled past filled with poorly dressed, weary city folk mixed with country girls, and women who were more conspicuous by their clean and colourful skirts. Some of the older folk betrayed their background by their attire, much of which would have been considered modern in pre-1914. Some of the older ladies stood out by their soft, wide-brimmed hats designed for summer sun protection, similar to the one my grandmother often wore when working in the garden. From the hospital staff, I learned much about the people of the town, and was also able to judge the wonderful level of care provided by the Russian nurses. One night, while suffering from a particularly unpleasant attack, and I was staggering along the corridor in search of help, a door suddenly flew open, and a woman in her 40s emerged and literally carried me back to my room. She remained at my bedside until the attack passed, and thereafter came each evening to make sure I got everything I needed. Her nursing was full of motherly tenderness and natural warmth. A number of young Russian medical students also worked in the hospital, most of whom were lively, funny, and full of the joys of life. One of them told me a funny story about a young doctor trainee who was nearly always in tears. When asked what was wrong, she replied that she was soon to be sent to Germany to complete her training, and she didn't want to leave her Piotr behind, her Peter, whereupon she was laughingly assured that her Piotr would surely remain true to her. This remark triggered fresh tears, and her reply was that while she was sure Piotr would remain faithful, she doubted whether she could remain faithful once she was in Germany. There were, of course, other memories of that hospital. One was a particularly painful injection into the base of my spine, followed by a long and uncomfortable tram ride back to the hospital, where the corridors were lined wall to wall with recently arrived wounded. While some were no doubt under the influence of painkillers, others were not, and never before had I been so moved by the quiet composure of the stoically waiting wounded German soldier. On that same day, I learned of Italy's surrender and Mussolini's downfall. 10 days later, I was on my way to the university clinic in Munich, and at midnight, just as the train was leaving the blacked-out station, a number of Russian target markers appeared in the sky overhead, illuminated target markers for bombers to zero in on. It was rumoured the enemy had begun an offensive in the south. At first light, we found ourselves rolling through pretty country with gently rolling hills, never guessing that just a few weeks later the battle would be ragging there too. Our journey took us via the towns of Fasto and Belaya Zerko, although I can only clearly remember a nighttime halt in Berdichu. In the small town of Brody, we observed its citizens out strolling in their Sunday best, and a colourful crowd enjoying a football game. Then we arrived in the city of Lemberg, now Lviv, where women and children in light summer clothing and shirt-sleeved workmen were sitting on the banks of the river, enjoying a sunny Sunday afternoon. In silent curiosity they observed the long row of train windows passing by, but only here and there was there an arm raised in greeting. I remember wishing there had been more, but I had then no way of knowing what the prevailing conditions were in the Reich. Only a day too later, when the leave train had halted at a station somewhere between Vienna and Salzburg, we encountered a crowd of people on the platform glaring at us angrily as if we were prisoners of war. Only then did I realize how I had expected too much of the people of Lemberg, and how Il Duce's Mussolini resignation must have cast a pall over everyone. Late in the afternoon of August 1st, our train pulled into Przemysl, Poland, where we were deloused and put up for the night. The train was not scheduled to reach the Reich until the following night. In the Przemysl barrack canteen, we noticed the coming and going of numerous German female Army, Air Force, and Red Cross auxiliaries who came to eat, talk, or simply write letters. Most appeared masculine and unattractive, which was not surprising considering they had been thrown into a rough, merciless world, a cruel milieu into which they, no doubt, tried hard to fit, although the insistence on avoiding all humour or friendly conversation revealed an inner vulnerability.